We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation about free speech, the First Amendment, freedom of expression, and how this relates both in the United States and internationally with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Now, we've been covering the whole gamut really here, Scott, haven't we? We've talked hate speech, what it is, what it isn't. We've talked about
all your countrymen giving the world a bunch of trouble, Mark.
Well, that's what we're most well known for. Just ask a quarter of the known world back in the 19th century. But I'd like to continue what we were just discussing in the earlier part, Scott. And really the idea that laws in other countries can impact constitutional elements within the United States. And you pointed out that really the system is kind of protected against that, which is why you can commit blasphemy against Islam, for example, on a social media company that appears in Saudi Arabia, for example. But you obviously can't be prosecuted for such things there. But is that going to be a continuation as we go on, or do we see changes in structure to, for example, the Supreme Court that could impact how the free speech protections, First Amendment protections are, what's the right word? Interpreted,
eviscerated, choose your adjective. Yeah, these are all possible. This is why we, as I said, I'll say it again. You could say it as many times. It's always good to say it. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, Mark. And without guarding against those who would, they don't, the murderers of free speech don't come to say, we're going to kill free speech. They say, we need to protect X, Y, or Z, or this is a vulnerable population, or this particular speaker is an ogre and a horrible person, and therefore they have to be silenced. It doesn't come with a full frontal assault on, the idea of free speech is bad and we shouldn't have it. In fact, they say it like they're protectors of free speech, like somehow this is, so they don't have an honest attack. It's not like persons who, in another contentious issue might be abortion rights. Abortion opponents often just say, we want to ban abortion writ large, all in. And then they can be attacked for that stance. But that's not how the anti-speech campaigners or activists work. They try to slide in and attack it from an oblique angle so that your defenses aren't up against it. And I think that's how these things slide in. I remember when they first put up the federal hate crime laws, and it was with sympathy towards racial and sexual orientation minorities who were assaulted. So some guy gets the life beat out of him because it's a racist attack. And the idea is that somehow there need to be extra charges on because of the nature of the attack. Now, what happens is those of us who stand up against that and say we shouldn't be able to punish people for the ideas, along with the compliant media, are shouted down by saying like somehow that's racist or something like that, or you're pro minorities being attacked, instead of just saying the ideas that people hold in one's head, whether they keep them to themselves or they espouse them, should never be punished criminally. But the trend has been moving away from that in the United States to the extent that it can. Now, there is that Supreme Court precedent limit where, okay, they're going to bump up against that. But could it change? Well, when the Supreme Court's packed with, the goal and vision of the Biden administration and the Schumer packing scheme would be to add enough Supreme Court justices so that basically any justice who had been appointed by a Republican would be outvoted or outnumbered. And, that threat is existing continuously as long as they may think they can succeed. Now, I think it's fortunate that they haven't succeeded, because I think it would be very detrimental to the country to significantly alter the composition of the court to achieve, those political gains. But the threat's there.
Indeed, it is. There's something quite fascinating that I've been hearing, and I've heard it around for a couple of years, and I've heard it in both America and the United Kingdom, and it's to talk about how, because obviously in the United Kingdom we don't have a First Amendment protection, although apparently there are protections for free speech, which are ever-moving goalposts in many ways, as has been demonstrated in recent weeks. But there's this idea, and I've seen it on both sides of the Atlantic, that misinformation is not protected under free speech laws or under the First Amendment. And I'd like your thoughts on that, Scott, with and a follow-up question after you've given me your.
Well, in the United States, hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, lying, you name it, is protected speech. It's okay to lie. Now, defaming someone or committing fraud against them or inducing them to commit fraud or any number of other things may be prohibited. But just lying, just saying it's raining out when it's sunny, or anything you want to say about a political, candidate, they're not arresting immigrants who commit crimes against the native born, for instance, which I think has been alleged in the UK as one of the quote unquote mistruths that's been reported. That's perfectly acceptable in the United States as a non-criminal act. There may be civil liabilities, especially for defamation, but not criminal.
Okay, so the reason I asked that question is because there has been, as you point out, there's been a lady arrested. I actually used to see her ex posts on this, but she was arrested for falsely naming the person who committed the stabbings that were the impetus, not necessarily the cause, but the impetus for the recent riots in the UK. And
So let me
she
just stop you right there with a US based law analysis of what you just said, if I could. Okay.
Sure.
So if that was done intentionally, then you could say that there may be some criminal implication. But basically, in the United States, the person who was falsely named, they would have a civil cause of action for defamation against the person who made that tweet. So they would have to sue that person, and they could then recover in a civil law context. But that person would not generally suffer any kind of criminal investigation or charge or sanction because what they said wasn't true.
The reason I take us down this particular rabbit hole is because the idea of misinformation implies that there's correct information, right? So there's
Yes.
two parts. There's correct information,
Yeah,
and
there's the information the
there's
Crown
everything else.
wants you to have, or
Right. And
the
so
Council on Foreign Relations says is okay.
the Trilateral Commission, et cetera, et
Yeah,
cetera.
name it.
So there's with that splitting of the two, there's information and there's misinformation. It brings to the fore the question of who is the arbiter of what is information and what is misinformation.
It's the people who have the guns, Mark. That's who's the arbiter.
Well, that's probably the most correct answer. But I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on that in terms of how such things are justified. So, for example, if somebody had been away on the Mir space station for a couple of years without any information, they
Right.
came back to Earth in
Imagine the world. Right.
2017, for example, maybe
Yeah.
2018, and they would look around and have the absolute firm belief that Donald Trump was a Russian asset
Yes.
and that he cooperated with the Russians to cheat Hillary
Putin's
Clinton.
greatest victory to place Trump atop the American power structure.
Absolutely.
His toady.
So that would have been, that was the information, right? And so at that point, when you have arbiters of what is information, what is misinformation, it's very clear that the power structures that are in place. I mean, Hillary Clinton, who was the top of the ticket, she was essentially the de facto leader of the Democratic Party at that point.
The
She was
author
saying,
of the Russia collusion,
yes,
her team anyway, the author of the Russia collusion hoax.
yes. And then, of course, you have the compliant media that was also pushing everything based on the Steele dossier, which was completely debunked. And so what you end up with is you have people who are clearly able to be wrong, deciding what is your truth.
And let's add one more component
Sure.
to that, Mark, which is that in a pre-Elon Musk Twitter, the dominant social media companies acting in lockstep with those government bodies to punish those who would speak truth to power, and say something that wasn't, approved.
So in the United States, currently, there is no arbiter of truth. Do we expect that to stay the same?
As long as people believe and fight for freedom, we have a chance. And Van Morrison said, "You can't stop us on the road to freedom. You can't stop us because our eyes can see." And I hope that that's still true. And
men of granite, men of insight. Scott Cosenza, a man of granite, a man of insight himself. Thanks ever so much for joining us. We'll be back after this short break on a whole new topic. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.